you have to see the irony in this, right? Like every day I find a way to laugh at myself. Like, come on, one should know better than to show up earlier and something could go wrong, and never hurts when you have a second computer. Can my screen be shared? Like, can you see my screen?
Not really. You can try again, perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe you could just share the application and we will see it instead of the entire monitor.
Okay. Well, I wanted to talk about a project that happened some years ago, and I've always believed that if you're going to talk about something, you really shouldn't be relying on your slides, right, to get you through the conversation, because it should be something that you remember pretty well. So let me see. I don't know. This is probably not what I'm supposed to do as far as like sharing everything, but I'm still going to try.
Perfect. We see your presentation now.
And what do you see? Do you see the whole of it or just one screen?
Yeah, all of it. Maybe you could just go to the presentation more. Oh. Perfect. We are all set.
Oh my goodness, right? This actually reminds me of a time when I flew to New Zealand to speak at a conference and my laptop died entirely before the conference. And, it was pretty far from home, and it was a tough situation. But at the time, and technology changes all the time, at the time I had a backup of everything in a flash drive and had it in my pocket just in case something happened. And you never know, you never know. So I want to go back in time and talk about a situation that happened to me and share a little story. And I want to try to keep it brief and open up to questions because I think that part can be more fun. So I was in a situation where I was the QA manager and working at a company. I was working at a company and I wasn't really included in a lot of the meetings. And I don't want to whine about that, like, oh my gosh, I wasn't included in the meetings. But here I was at a company where the new product was being built and there was one key flagship product at the company. And a new version was being planned. And I wasn't part of the conversation. I didn't really know what the plan was. I didn't know what was going to be built. Rumors started to happen in the hallway, which was where I was picking up most of the information. No one was really asking me for anything. And on the one hand, you could go with that. You could just say, okay, fine. Nobody's really asking me for anything, but I could see this situation just building where a lot of conversation about the product was happening and expectations and how it was going to be, the next best thing. And it was going to solve all sorts of problems. And I wasn't on the inside of understanding what was going to happen. And to this day, so I was trying to think a lot about, maybe a situation that has happened, but has happened more than once, right? To this day, I realize when you're not part of the conversation, it can be a problem. And you don't even know sometimes when the conversations have started. So you don't even know to ask. You don't even know what's being talked about. And you might not really be pulled in. And I've seen it at a number of companies where QA managers, testers are not always brought into meetings. And then when they are brought in, maybe it's a little late. So I guess this was one of the things that I've learned is that you really have to find a way to get into part of the conversation. So here's the thing that I get a kick out of when I speak at a conference or I'm listening to anyone. You can stand in front of a group of people and say, well, what you have to do is go and get invited to these key meetings. But okay, fine. But how? Right? Like when I'm sitting and I'm listening to somebody, I'm like, but how? How exactly do you do that? So I think what I've been finding over years, and I have been kind of asking myself that question, how did I solve it here and how did I solve it there? Because this is a repeat problem that I think happens in testing. I think you have to find the language of the company that you're working in, and you have to find an ally of some type where you can make an appeal and you can explain what it is that you do, what it is that you bring, how it is that you're going to help, to try to find a way to get involved, and to get involved as early as you can. And that might sound rather general, very consultant-like. I don't think there's one answer. I think it's just you have to figure out what your value is, and that can vary a little bit based on the company and sort of who you're perceived as and what your level of influence is and how you can go about being included. But it's an important piece that really can't be, it really kind of can't be stressed enough. So I thought it would be fun. I don't know, because I'm a dork, I guess. I'm going to keep watching the time myself. I thought it would be fun if some of the statements that I made were kind of put in if then else. And that's what I would say here as well. So I had an eye on, slides that get to live longer than your talk, right? So I think the whole thing about gaining a seat at the table is figuring out like who you are at the table. And if you do hear the goals early on, then you can align to it. So what was happening to me back in sort of this story was product was basically internally advertising that the next version was going to be the best thing, like the best thing ever. And the biggest problem at the time was performance. So there's a website, there were performance issues, the next version was going to fix all that because of, whatever it was, whatever the technology was, which really doesn't matter. But what started to happen was people were getting sold in it. I could tell like my boss and his boss and all the people that sort of mattered to me were all convinced that performance was going to be better and everything would be fine, which was fine. I mean, it just sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It's like, it sounds so soothing, like all our performance problems will be solved. But I was really left having to be the one who had to really deconstruct it. So the easy thing to say is, oh, you should have SMART goals, right? But what does that even mean? And, we know what it means, right? Specific and measurable. In this situation for me, I was the one breaking down what sounded really wonderful into very tactical tasks that, I'll be honest, no one wanted to hear about them. So it's interesting that within the testing community, I feel like people would be excited. They'd be like, oh, so how did you model production? Well, what did your numbers look like? What tool were you using? All of the details, I couldn't really find anyone to be very interested in them. And I sensed, and I probably was getting feedback too, that they just didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear about the details. So I had to go backwards even lower than that. I had to try to find ways to communicate. If it's going to be better than production, then let's understand what production is today. And let's break it down. So I'm just going to throw out numbers just for sake of, making it easier. Say there's 5,000 users on, right? So small numbers, but we have 5,000 users on. Great. But what are they doing, right? Like I have to model production. And I didn't have any information really about what production looked like at the time. And again, I didn't really have a technical ally that I could go to and try to figure it out. So I had to figure it out myself. And then I had to find a way to make the information somewhat interesting or at least compatible to the goals. So what I was discovering is that it's really like, it's like having a layer of translation where you can take somebody's high level goal and turn it into something that's reasonably tactical without getting so detailed into the tool that the executives I was working with would just shut me down, not really be interested in hearing about it. And I actually started using analogies to the highway. Well, are we talking about like Sunday night? Performance is fast because nobody's really on the road. Are we talking about Monday morning and what rush hour looks like? Like, tell me what you think, what's better than what? And trying to ask questions, but not asking so many that, I was perceived as a pain in the tail and, get her out of these meetings, right? So trying to figure out a language that people could relate to, and trying to get people kind of interested in my cause, which is interesting because, if you look at it, usually at the executive level, a plan is made, and I'm one of many people who's actually executing to make that strategy happen, not the test strategy, but like the overall strategy happen. I'm a piece, I'm a component of it. You would think there'd be inherent interest in what I'm doing. But what I find is if I get too detailed talking about testing, a lot of times the executives, their eyes will glaze over, and then I won't get the information back that I need. So trying to figure out a way to really communicate, I'm flipping through slides a little bit here, which I hate doing, but I think some of it's the virtue of being a little bit late to the table this morning, which I apologize for, and also just trying to really reminisce and think back about the story. And I see it happen. I see it happen even now, where I'll get invited to a meeting and a tester or a test manager will be describing something to me. They'll start talking to me in automation tools, which is fine. That's cool. I'm all right with that. But the minute a screen gets pulled up and the automation tool is just running in the background and they're showing me how the tool runs, I have to admit, even I'm getting to a place where I'm like, okay, it's not what I want to see. It's not what I want to hear about. And I've come to realize that it takes some time and it takes some practice of learning how to speak in almost different languages and thinking about what your audience is. People don't really want to see an automation tool run. They want to know, what was your thinking behind it? What am I seeing run? Why did you build that? What is it trying to accomplish? How will I know if it accomplished that or not? What's the outcome of it? And I've coached a number of testers now, and I remind myself of that all the time. Be careful. When you pull up a tool and you're showing the automation running, that's fine if you want to do it as a background. Like right now, I have these slides as a background, right? They're not really what's pulling me through it. It's the memory of what happened and the brutal learning of it. I mean, I'll be honest, right? This is all about, Project Doom. It was going horribly. Like I learned so much from this project. I can barely even convey it because the memory is just built in that I think at the time I felt like everything I was doing was wrong. And I couldn't catch up and I couldn't figure it out. I learned a lot from this one, but I'll tell you at the time, it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't as if it went well. It's only in hindsight that you can put together slides that make it look like it was pretty. On the inside, it was a bit of a mess. And the same was true as I was going through and doing testing and finding information. And that was a time when I started to realize how you talk about defects depends on who's in the room. And it doesn't mean that you're not still speaking the truth, but it's how you're presenting that information so that it's digestible. If I give you an example of, I have this defect and, the website crashes, okay, that's fine. But what do you do with that information? It's like, was it a normal, and what is normal, right? Is it a normal load of users and what was going on and what triggered it and what was going on before that? And it's the context. And I think a lot of times defects can be like that pinpoint of time where something bad happened, but sometimes it's the story about how you got to something bad that happened that you really need to explain, or you need to explain the likelihood. I think this goes back to one of the things that I learned about software testing that I think is really hard. That's not in these slides, right? It's a hard job, and I don't think it's really understood that way. I think there's a large skill set where you have to be quiet, thoughtful, analytical. You're sitting at your desk, you're calculating, you're figuring out tools and strategy on how you're going to do things. And then you need almost the whole opposite set of skills to go down the hall and talk in a different language and feed that information back up in a way that makes sense and pulls you out of the weeds and gets you back to a higher level of explaining what the heck it is that you learned. And those are different skills. It's kind of like when I would work as a tester in alongside a team, what I needed all day was so different from what I needed speaking at a conference. And I don't see that reconciled, right? There are testers who, they're fantastic testers and they'll never speak at a conference, and that's fine. That's completely fine. But can they go down the hall and talk to a group of people? Can they be pulled into an executive meeting and be able to respond to it? And I think the honest piece that I want to share is, to this day, that is a challenge for me, because I'm constantly having to calibrate to a different audience. You know, technology is easy. People are complicated, and figuring it out is not a one-time event. And I think that is one of the most important things I want to share. So I'm like way off from my slides, but I don't think any of us have ever thought the slides had mattered. They'll live past me. I want to do a sanity check on time, if I may.
We are almost there. Perhaps if you're done, we could take questions if you like.
Yeah, I'd love questions. I would.
Okay, cool. So there's a question from Kshitij: toxic versus conductive. How would you differentiate the right environment support needed to drive testing?
How would you? I'm sorry, I missed that.
So on the toxic versus conductive topic, Kshitij is asking, how would you differentiate the right environment support needed to drive the testing?
You need to have support, and if you can't translate between the tactical testing that you're doing and the higher level goals, then you have to figure out a way to do it for yourself, which might not be that easy, right, if you don't know how to really translate it. So I would say the main thing is constantly going back to what the overall goals are, and then trying to align what am I doing in testing that matches up to these goals, and being able to translate the language in between those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there is another question, I think, a couple of them talking about how do testers create value with testing? How do you communicate the value as a tester?
Well, I like being in the mode of being a reporter, which probably goes back to my journalism background. So I don't create the state of the product. I can just report on the state of the product. And so it would be my preference as a tester to be seen as a reporter of, let me tell you what I really have seen, what is really there, as opposed to what's supposed to be there or what we think will be there. I would say more often now I function more as an advisor than I do in other capacities. But as a tester, I think the best thing you could be seen is to be seen as objective, and that you're really reporting based on what your experience was with the product.
Okay, that's interesting.